children and adolescents who have traumatic brain injury. So what I wanted to talk about tonight is really kind of addressing executive function in persons with traumatic brain injury, because it's an important area that we frequently see children struggle with after traumatic brain injury. And so I'm going to talk about sort of a general rehabilitation approach to supporting executive functions in children, and we'll take it from there. So why is it important to address executive function in persons with brain injury? Well, there are actually a few good reasons. When we think about, especially with regards to traumatic brain injury, so there's frequently damage to the frontal and temporal regions of the brain, regardless of how the injury occurs. Those are just vulnerable areas in head injury. And we also understand that those areas of the brain are, those frontal areas of the brain are responsible for the executive functions, and the impact of that can be pretty significant for children after a traumatic brain injury. And so we know that these are common issues, and these issues can interfere with a child's ability to be successful in school, to be successful socially, and that kind of thing. And so it's definitely an important area to address. So what are the executive functions? Well, there's no one singular definition per se, but we can think about it in a couple of different ways. And so one definition here is an umbrella term, sort of encompassing interrelated skills necessary for purposeful, goal-directed activity. So that purposeful, goal-directed activity is what we're really talking about when we are referring to executive functions. Another definition, capacities that enable a person to engage successfully in independent, purposeful, self-serving behaviors. So once again, there's the purposeful and also independent, so being able to independently perform these behaviors. So if we think about the role of executive functions, sometimes it's helpful to use analogies to sort of explain that a little bit. So when we think about executive functions, we can kind of think about them as operating as maybe the conductor of the orchestra, the CEO of a corporation, general of the army, or the head coach of the team. And so that's really what our executive functions do for us. They are kind of leading or orchestrating all of the other cognitive processes that are important in goal-directed behavior. So if we think about executive functions as the conductor of the orchestra, so what are the functions of the conductor? To initiate goal-directed action, to manage working memory, and we'll talk about what all of these mean in coming slides, to help with planning and organizing, to self-monitor, to be aware of your own behavior and to be able to accurately evaluate your own behavior, to inhibit or not respond impulsively, to be appropriately flexible in your behavior and your problem solving, to regulate your own emotional response, and to be self-aware, to understand that, to be aware that there actually are some difficulties that you may be experiencing. So here are some definitions of each one of those terms. So once again, inhibit is to stop an action, to not react to impulse. To shift or flexibility, to be able to move from one task or situation to another with ease. Emotional control is regulating our own emotional response. Initiate basically means beginning a task or an activity, or initiating attention to the important information in the environment. It's getting started, more or less. Working memory is being able to hold information actively in mind, to complete an immediate task or activity. Plan, that involves anticipating future events and developing steps in order to be able to implement a plan for those, anticipate future events to be able to develop steps to implement a plan. Organize basically just means to establish and maintain order. And there's a lot of different ways we can think about that. We'll go over that as well. Self-monitor just means attending to your behavior and your output and then revising as necessary. So what are the functions of the orchestra? So the orchestra are all the other cognitive functions that our brain is responsible for basic perception of sound, perception of sight, perception of the way things feel, tactile perception, all of those kinds of things are related to perception. Conceptual thinking, so being able to form a concept about information is very important, especially with abstract thinking. Language processes, visual spatial processes, memory, so memory for new information, sensory inputs, motor outputs, emotion, and knowledge and skills. So could be social, could be non-social, but all of our previously learned knowledge and information. So this is what the orchestra is doing. And so it's up to the conductor or our executive functions to help ensure that all of these processes work appropriately. So we can think about it as a sort of a bidirectional relation. Oops, let me go back. A bidirectional relationship. So information is sent from the conductor to the different sections of the orchestra, and then it sends back information back to the conductor, who then adjusts or changes the behavior appropriately as the situation calls for. So what are some critical features of executive control functions? What do they help us do? Well, they help us provide for delayed responding, so not responding immediately, seeing the cookie on the table and not immediately grabbing it and eating it, for example. Being future-oriented, so being able to think about things that are going to be occurring and to successfully plan for those things. Being strategic in your course of action. Being intentional. Being able to anticipate what might occur. Being able to be free from distractions or other interference. Ability to sequence behavioral output, so being able to put together the correct steps and sequences of tasks that we need to perform. What are the demand situations for executive functions? Well, we know that there are certain situations where executive functions are definitely going to be important in helping us manage a task or activity. So whenever there's a multiple step task or multiple step learning, there's going to be higher demands on executive functions. When something is new, so we don't have a lot of experience with it, it's going to be more challenging versus things that are more automatic or familiar. High stress versus low stress. So high stress situations put more demands on the executive functions. Future versus present orientation. So basically any event that is future that's not occurring in the here and now puts more demands on the executive functions. Once again, being intentional, whenever we have to be intentional in our actions or what we choose to do, those are higher demands on our executive functions as well. The executive functions also contribute to other areas of functioning. So when we think about language, for instance, so language-based problem solving, so reading and writing, for instance, it puts demands on working memory, organization of information, being able to think flexibly about a topic. Nonverbal problem solving. So when tasks are more nonverbal, oftentimes they may be new, unfamiliar, definitely put demands on organization and our ability to think flexibly about the task that we're performing. Communication. So being able to communicate effectively requires us to sort of organize our thoughts, to not be impulsive and to say whatever comes to mind, and then to be able to hold what we're talking about in our mind so that we don't lose track or forget what we were saying. So what happens if we don't focus on executive functions in treatment? Well, with luck, the child will develop some sporadic independent problem-solving skills. But what's more likely to happen is the child will develop learned helplessness, so that basically meaning that they're going to be reliant on others, more dependent, and this often also leads to opposition towards caregivers because frustrations of things not being completed for them or being overwhelmed by a task and that kind of thing. And so if we don't address executive functions, there can definitely be an increase in frustration and really having to rely on others for help in situations where the individual may actually be able to perform the task. So when we think about executive function intervention, we're going to be talking about a few different things. So one is, if we're going to discuss or address executive functions, we need to really be sure what we're talking about. What are we working with here? So we need to have an assessment that identifies what the areas of executive function deficits are, associated domain-specific abilities or deficits. So for instance, having difficulties with impulsivity and emotional control, or working memory and planning and organization, and the demands, the situational demands where those issues become a problem. We also need to determine the overall functioning level of the child to be sure that we're having the appropriate expectations for executive function. So if a individual is more severely impacted in terms of the brain injury on their cognition, we're gonna have to, that doesn't mean that we can't address executive functions, but we just need to be sure that we're thinking about goals and objectives that are appropriate to what that individual can actually perform. So when we think about intervention, there's a few things that we want to focus on. So one of the primary sort of overall goals is to teach goal-directed problem-solving processes. And we want to do that with an everyday meaningful routine. So that means in the activities that the child is going to be participating in at home, at school, socially, wherever that may be. There needs to be some real world relevance and application of what we're doing. So, we definitely want this to have a meaningful impact on the child and their everyday activities. And we also want to use key people in the child's life to serve as models or coaches or co-conductors, as we might think about it, in order to to implement these executive function strategies. So when we think about the executive function interventions, what we're talking about is initially having things be very external, directed by the other persons in the individual's life, adults, family members, teachers, that kind of thing, guiding this process. And then over time, having that go from a more of an external way of having the support to the child being able to, through repetition, have that become a more internalized process so that they're able to independently demonstrate skills that will support their executive function. So you have external models of multiple step problem solving routines, external guidance to develop and implement everyday routines, practice and application of use of these routines, and then eventually you start to fade the external support to just cueing, so that the person can internally generate and use these routines. And eventually the idea is that this becomes more automatic, so that even the external support and the cueing is no longer necessary. It takes a while, and of course it varies on how severely the person's executive functions are impacted, how old they are, and a variety of other types of factors that might go into that. But for sure, the goal is that we're going to start off with a lot of structure and external support, and then we're going to phase that out to more sort of cueing, reminding the child of the strategies and routines, and then eventually have that to go to more of a just internal, where the child is doing these things on his or her own. So external to internal processes. So we want to have internal control to generate and use specific problem-solving routines. So this would be something that the child is eventually doing on their own. Being able to generalize whatever the skill or routine is to a new situation. At first, this may require some external assistance or guidance, but once again, this eventually we would hope that this could be done independently. As the child accumulates experience and examines different conditions for selective use of various routines, that will allow them to do these things more independently. And then, we're going to provide feedback throughout. So, giving the child information about how they're doing. Sometimes, a child may not be internally motivated to do this on their own. And so, we can add some sort of reward system so that they're getting some positive reinforcement, maybe earning a privilege or something of that type, to keep them motivated to continue working on these strategies. So structuring an executive function rehabilitation program, what we want to do is we want to do everyday routines. For example, goal, plan, do, review. We'll talk about that in the next slide. We want to support working memory via a hard copy of the routine. So at first, we're not going to expect this to be internalized. There needs to be some kind of external, written or picture-based information that will help cue the child to what they're doing. And allowing the child to become increasingly more active in formulating plans and reviewing their own performance. So, over time, we want them to be able to, independently generate a plan for how to solve a problem and hopefully become more accurate in evaluating their performance. So here is an example of one of those everyday problem-solving routines. This is by Mark Ilfasacker and his associate, I can't remember the first name, Feeney. And there are a variety of these types of problem-solving routines in the literature, but this is one I like a lot. And so basically, I'll kind of walk you through what this is like. So basically, you can see that there are the main components: goal, plan, do, review. So at each one of these steps here, what we want is for the child to be asking the question. And we may ask this question for the child at first, but we want them to eventually be asking the questions for the goal. So what do I want to accomplish? What's the point of whatever I'm doing? Where's the end result going to lead me? Because a lot of times, persons who have executive function difficulties, they'll start a task kind of haphazardly and maybe not know what the end product should be. So we want to be clear that, clear of what our goal is. And then we'll get to the plan. And so we're going to ask, how am I going to accomplish my goal? And, so one way to think about this is, what types of materials or equipment do I need in order to perform this task? Do I have paper and pen? Do I have the notes from the teacher? Do I have, my computer, whatever it may be, whatever materials or equipment are needed? And then what are the steps that are needed in order to accomplish this task? Then once we have those things together, we ask the child to predict how well he or she will do. So, you think this is going to be easy, or you think this is going to be hard? So, if they think it's going to be easy, maybe they would give themselves a lower rating. So I have a 1 to 10 scale here. So maybe they would say, oh, it's going to be super easy, that's a 1, or it's going to be really hard, it's a 10. And then whoever's working with the child, the parent, the teacher, the therapist, could also rate how difficult they think it's going to be for the child. And like, oh, I don't know, you said that was going to be pretty easy, but this is something you've never done before. It's a little tricky. So I'm going to give it a 7. And then from that, ask the child's supposed to ask, well, how much of this am I going to get done, right now? Some tasks are going to be big where we're not going to complete everything at one time. So that helps them anticipate that. And then you actually implement the plan. Even with the best developed plans, problems occur. And so when a problem occurs, we just have, the child list what the problem is, and then identify possible solutions to that problem. Should I ask for help? Should I use the book that maybe has some more information about this in it? Should I call a friend who's in my class to get more information? Just generating different solutions to solve whatever the problem may be. Then finally, when this whole planning process has been completed and they've done the task, then they go back and review. So the child asks himself, all right, how did I do? And this is based on how difficult they thought the task was. And so, if they said that the task was going to be really easy, but it ended up being kind of difficult, well, that increases their self-awareness of their own problem-solving ability. If they still say it was easy after the problem-solving has been completed, then that allows the parent or adult who's working with the child to sort of remind them, oh, remember, you got really frustrated. It took you longer than you thought. And I still think we should rate it more along a 7. Or, conversely, maybe the child will have said at the outset, I think this is I'm going to have a hard time. I'm going to give myself a 10. But they do the task, they're successful, and they're like, oh, hey, it wasn't that bad. Breaking it down this way helped me work my way through it. And so, but once again, you have the adult rater to add their information, and if there's any discrepancies there, that can be discussed. Then there's a couple more questions that you ask. So one would be, what worked? What went well? And another would be, what didn't work? And then finally, what will I try next time? And that allows them to once again sort of develop that anticipatory set, or having a routine that they can modify the next time they do the task, so that they're more successful by avoiding or addressing the problems that occurred the first time more proactively. So, I'll give an example of this with just kind of like a very simple, common, everyday sort of activity. So let's say that the child's has been asked to take out the trash, for instance. So goal, what do I want to accomplish? I want to take the trash from the kitchen to the garbage can in the garage. How will I accomplish my goal? What materials or equipment do I need? Well, maybe not much. I guess I need a new trash bag, but maybe that's about it. So what are the steps? Well, first I'm going to go to the kitchen trash can. I'm going to pull the bag out of the can. I will tie it off. and then set it aside. Then I will put the new bag into the trash can, secure it, and then I'll take the full bag to the garage and place it in the garage trash can. So prediction, how well will I do? I think that seems pretty easy. I'm gonna do just fine. The adult says, well, sometimes, that ends up being kind of frustrating for you when we've done it in the past. So I'm gonna say maybe a 5. So then the child, implements the plan to take out the trash. Maybe something goes wrong, maybe something doesn't. Something that might go wrong is the trash is too full and to tie off. What would you do in that situation? Well, I guess I could ask my mom and dad for help. They takes out the trash and the bag breaks. That's frustrating. What could you do to help with that? Well, maybe next time I could put the full trash bag in another bag so that if it breaks, it will be caught by the second bag. I mean, something along those lines. Then you get to the review. You have them rate themselves again on how they did. What worked? Well, I got the trash out to the trash can. What didn't work? Maybe I forgot to put a new bag or an empty bag into the kitchen trash can. What will I do different next time? I'll be sure that I put the empty trash bag into the trash can before I take the trash out, the full trash bag out, that kind of thing. And so that's sort of an example of how this could work, but a very sort of simple activity. But the nice thing about this type of routine is it can be used for a variety of different types of problems, from everyday activities around the house. It can be used for social situations, such as inviting someone over to play, when we used to do that before COVID-19. It could be something academic. Writing a paragraph or an essay on a topic given by a teacher, that kind of thing. It works for all of those situations. We also want to have executive function intervention occur across a variety of different contexts. So it's helpful to coordinate executive function intervention across therapies, from the home to the school and that kind of thing. If everybody is kind of working towards a similar goal and using these kind of executive function routines and strategies, that's very helpful. Utilizing similar strategies like goal, plan, do, review. Maybe having a common executive function routines notebook that the child has with them that can be used in the different environments and that kind of thing. And then I think the big thing is just communication. Just once again, being sure that everyone is on the same page, being sure that, they can go a variety of different ways, that maybe too much support is not being provided. Sometimes that could be a problem. Someone is doing everything for the child that they could be doing on their own. It could be that maybe they're getting not enough support. They're just being left a little bit to their own devices when they're not prepared quite yet to demonstrate these types of problem-solving routines on their own. But communication is important in that regard. So we'll talk here about some specific interventions to address some of the individual domains or areas of executive function. So if a child has problems initiating or getting started on a task, well, one thing that we can do is increase the structure of the task so there's a clear starting point. Establish and rely on routines, so being sure that we have a good routine for whatever the task is. Determine a minimal level of cue to help start, and then being able to reduce this over time, so a little reminder or that kind of thing, so that the child can actually get started on it. Being sure that we're breaking the task down into small, manageable steps. Placing the child with a partner or group for modeling, maybe cueing from peers, that kind of thing, so they're getting external feedback. And I think that, reframing a lack of motivation as an initiation deficit for whoever it is. You know, a lot of times, you know, teachers or, you know, someone may think that the child is just sort of lazy or unmotivated, but we understand that when a child has difficulties with executive function, you know, related to a brain injury, oftentimes they don't get started because it just doesn't occur to them or they don't know how. But if we provide them with the reminder or the cue to start and give them a way to do it, they'll end up doing it just fine. So it really doesn't have to do with a lack of motivation or laziness, but it's just, you know, difficulty getting started without external support. Sustaining interest. So, you know, being able to focus and concentrate is challenging after a brain injury. In order to improve, you know, that ability to focus and concentrate, it really helps for the task to be interesting. So we want to increase the salience in the task, the meaningfulness of that task for the child, relying on high interest tasks. Hands-on activities are definitely more, I think, helpful in terms of sustaining attention and that kind of thing. Asking the child to choose among different topics can be helpful. That way they're making the choice of what's more interesting to them. Whenever that happens, they have an increased investment in whatever they're doing. Use verbal strategies to help them remain on focus. So, you know, basically, you know, just little words like, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? You know, where are you? And, you know, in this thing, just little reminders to be sure that they're going back to the task at hand. And then finally, you know, writing down a list of what to attend to for a specific task. So they have some something to think about before they actually get started to kind of cue their interest. Sustaining working memory. So working memory, once again, is a child's ability to hold information in their mind in order to complete an immediate task. So this is one of those kind of things where, you know, as a parent, you say, go to your room, get your jacket, your backpack, and your phone, and they come back having maybe only brought their phone because they couldn't hold that information in their working memory. They got distracted. And so completing those multiple step instructions is frustrating. So what we can do is, of course, repeat instructions as needed. You know, this can be, if it's in a classroom environment, this could be quietly. It doesn't have to be called or singled out, but repetition is always important. Being aware that we want the instructions that we're giving the child to be clear and concise. We don't want to overwhelm them or overload them with too many extra words, too much information at once, because that will overwhelm their working memory system. Being sure that we're breaking tasks down into smaller steps or chunks that they can approach one piece at a time. Providing a hard copy or written, you know, instructions for what they're supposed to be doing. Also, you can use a script. So if it's something that they're doing every day that they're having a trouble forgetting, you know, like when they're getting ready in the morning, they are forgetting to brush their teeth, for instance, or that kind of thing. You can develop a specific script or a blueprint or a routine dealing with that specific situation, so that what that does is through the repetition of that routine, it reduces the demands on the working memory, and it's more likely that the child will perform that task independently in the future. Inhibiting or, you know, impulsivity. So what can we do to help with this? Well, certainly increasing structure in the environment is going to be helpful. The more structured and planned in a task or an activity and environment is going to be, the better. You know, setting limits for, you know, what's appropriate versus what is not appropriate. Being very clear with what the behavior and work expectations are, reviewing those with the child, posting rules for behavior and view, point to them when a child breaks a rule. There are also different types of response delay techniques. So for instance, you know, counting to 10, practicing counting to 10 before actually responding, or, you know, asking a question or getting out of the seat or that kind of thing can be those response delay techniques can be helpful with that. Shifting. So being able to be flexible, both in your behavior and in your thinking. So once again, increasing routine during the day helps with shifts. If the child knows a routine and there's going to be a transition at this point in time, that helps them deal with that transition better. Making the schedule clear in public, letting the child know of any changes that are going to happen in that routine. Give a 2-minute warning when it's time to change or to do something different, so they have it, once again, sort of have some time to adjust to making that change. Making changes from one task to the next or one topic to the next very clear and explicit. Sometimes shifting can be a problem of impulsivity. So sometimes the strategies used for inhibition can also be helpful with shifting, depending on the nature of the problem. Organizing. So organization can be very challenging for persons with executive function deficits. So one of the things that's, if we can increase the organization in the environment, that's going to help a lot. If a classroom is very disorganized, or if the room where they're trying to work is very disorganized, it makes organizing anything else more of a challenge. When a child is involved in therapy, increasing the organization of the therapy session, to serve as a model and to help the child grasp the structure of new information. Present the framework for new information to be learned at the beginning and then review at the end of the lesson. So that basically allows the child to understand sort of beforehand what we're going to be doing, so that as those things occur, they're able to sort of organize it better in their mind. And finally, begin tasks with only a few steps and then increase the number of steps gradually as the child demonstrates success with whatever the number of steps that are being worked on. Planning. So similar kinds of things here. Practicing a task with only a few steps. You definitely don't want to have, when they're learning these problem-solving routines, you don't want to start off with an overly complex task, because it kind of sets the child up for failure. So you want to use a task that only has a few steps at first. Teach simple flow charting. So, pictures or diagrams that show, first you do this, and then there's an arrow to another box that says, and then that you do this. And if this doesn't happen, then you do this. Those kind of visualizations of a task can be very helpful. They can practice planning activities. So for instance, those paper and pencil maze kind of problems, or worksheets, that kind of thing, puzzles can be helpful. Before a child gets started on a task, you can have them verbalize their plan, what they're going to do. Have them verbalize a second plan if the first one doesn't work. Ask the child to verbalize possible consequences of actions before beginning. And then review episodes or incidents of poor planning or anticipation with the child. So once again, they can hopefully be more aware of that in the next task or situation when those planning demands are high. So I also wanted to talk about, so those are some very specific kind of cognitive related kinds of coping strategy or sort of techniques to support executive functions. I also wanted to talk about just some general positive coping strategies. Certainly having a TBI can be very stressful. And the stress, also has a negative impact on our cognitive functioning. And so it can make the executive function issues even more problematic if the child is extremely stressed. There are many helpful coping strategies for dealing with stress associated with TBI. And this is not all encompassing, but with things that we know are aerobic activity or exercise, cognitive activities and games, and relaxation strategies in psychotherapy. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We definitely know that there is a lot of research that shows aerobic activity is helpful to our cognitive functioning. This is true for everyone, but it's also true for persons with traumatic brain injury. And so, there's going to be positive ramifications of aerobic activity on cognitive functioning and emotional functioning as well. And so that's important to know. There are actual changes that occur in the brain when we do aerobic activity that support, growth of new neurons, overall better brain functioning. We're getting more oxygen to the brain. The brain utilizes a lot of oxygen, more oxygen than any other organ in our body. And so if we're sending more oxygen and more blood flow there, then that's a good thing. Cognitive activities. So engaging in cognitively stimulating activities. These aren't related to those things that we were talking about, those ways of supporting executive functions earlier. These are just kind of fun things that a child may do. There's no single activity that is recommended more than another, but there are some. We'll talk a little bit about those. Social interaction is also important to mental stimulation. So interacting with others, spending time with friends, volunteering, joining a club, participating in a church or a spiritual group, attending a camp, all of those kinds of things are very positive to, both to cognitive functioning and just overall well-being. Engaging in cognitive stimulating activities. Here are just some examples: crosswords, Sudoku, computer games, board games, card games, little memory strategies like learning an acronym to help you remember information. All of these kinds of things can be helpful and positive and have a good impact on a child's cognitive functioning. When we think about stress, certainly we know TBI is associated with stress, anxiety, and depression. The emotional stress comes from a variety of different areas. I mean, this could be lack of understanding from others, so peers in particular, or teachers not understanding the issues that are going on, loss or change in friendships, inability to participate in previously enjoyed activities. So for instance, maybe they played football before and they're unable to, they're not medically cleared to do so. And then just kind of difficulty managing schoolwork and other responsibilities. These are all just some of the things that can contribute to stress. And so when we think about addressing stress, there are certain things that can be done. A child can certainly do these with the support of others and eventually on their own. One of the simplest and best things that we can do is diaphragmatic breathing or progressive muscle relaxation. This is just really simple, focusing on breathing in a slow and steady way. And I have some different apps here that are available for Android or Apple. These are just a couple. I'm not endorsing these per se, but just some ones to be aware of. So there's like Breathe to Relax, Breathing Zone. And basically what these apps do is they lead the user to through a good relaxation breathing kind of exercise. And so sometimes doing it with an app is easier than doing it independently or on your own. Meditation, also good. There are some nice apps that address this. Headspace and Calm are two of the more popular ones, but there are a variety of them. Yoga, also good. Yoga kind of has a benefit of having a combination of all these things, deep breathing, sort of meditative in a way in terms of focusing on one task and not having the thoughts sort of scattered all over the place. There are some good apps for that as well. Yoga Studio, Daily Yoga are available. And then finally, psychotherapy. So, if a child is having any mental health problem, be it anxiety, depression, whatever is related to stress, this can be addressed by talking with a psychologist or other mental health professional. And, basically, usually the easiest way to find a referral for psychotherapy is through the child's primary care doctor or whoever the TBI specialist, the rehabilitation doctor, neurologist, or whoever else works with your child regularly. Those would be good sources for identifying, a psychotherapist, a counselor, a psychologist for a child. And I would say, psychotherapy can be helpful for anyone, but certainly if there are bigger concerns about a child, being depressed or being so anxious that it's interfering with their daily activities, significant anger, that kind of thing, those are situations where psychotherapy can be helpful. And I'd say, once again, it's important to recognize that emotional health and cognitive health, these don't occur in individual silos. They're definitely related. The more stressful, more stress a person feels, the more difficulty they're going to have with their cognitive abilities. And if a person has a brain injury, their cognitive abilities are being sort of stretched to the max already. And so the emotional difficulties just drain the tank further and, exacerbate the cognitive problems and can make the emotional problems worse. And so I think all of these things kind of go together and are important when we're thinking about the overall health of a child.